right. So I have two new leaders for Blexit here. I'm going to have them introduce themselves and let you guys know how they got started. But go ahead and introduce yourself, Janelle.
So my name is Janelle Lovato, and I am a member of Legacy Church. And how I got involved, Legacy Church had hosted Freedom Night at their church, and Charlie Kirk had come. And so my daughter went up for a question at the end asking, how to get involved, being that she's more like in a bubble to help more in the public schools with everything that's coming against her generation. And that's when Charlie Kirk encouraged her to start a Turning Point chapter at her school. And from there, our pastor, Steve Smotherman, appointed her president. And from there, it just really inspired me as a mother and a parent to get involved. And so now I'm the state director of New Mexico for Blexit.
Right on. Devon?
So my name is Devaney Scales, and I also go to Legacy Church, and my sons actually go to school with Janelle's daughter, and I just got involved too. I was also at the Freedom Night that same night, and Charlie Kirk had been there many times, and my kids also just wanted to be involved and help, and so I, since my kids are involved with Janelle's daughter, I kind of partnered with Janelle and kind of helped get the chapter at the school up and running, and then just wanted to get more involved, and then she came to me with Blexit, and then asked me if I would be the assistant state director. So here I am helping Janelle with that.
Right on. All right. So yeah, we're trying to get this thing running on all cylinders. Obviously it's an important election year, and we want to affect our nation for the best. And so obviously New Mexico has a lot of self-inflicted hardships from our people in power, people in political office. And so we want to expose what's happening, what policies they're forcing. And we actually want to go ahead and start with Sarah and Juan. Are you good, Sarah?
Yep.
Okay. Give some details of what's happening present day New Mexico.
Right. So just to introduce real quick, I'm Sarah Smith, and I'm in Las Cruces, a concerned mother. And Juan, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yes, I'm Juan Garcia. I'm the chairman of the Coalition of Conservatives in Action in Las Cruces also.
And we have been, over the last 6 months, heavily involved in challenging some of the things that are going on in Las Cruces public schools, including age-inappropriate, sexually explicit materials that are in the school libraries. And so that's been a pretty interesting process, identifying that there are books both in middle schools and high schools here that are really not appropriate. One of the recent ones that we've been looking at it's an adult book. It's sold as adult erotic fiction, and it's listed in a middle school library and 3 high school libraries. And that book is in other districts too. It's not just a Las Cruces problem. When I look at Albuquerque, when I look at Santa Fe, other districts, these books are in those school libraries as well.
Yes, and I agree with Sarah. Some of the literature that we have found, and again, we're not about book banning. All we want is for citizens and parents to become actively engaged and determine what's age appropriate for their kids. I know it's a little bit of a touchy subject, especially from our progressive friends who automatically default to you're banning books. We haven't banned any books. We haven't burned any books. We don't plan to burn any books. But somebody needs to step up and determine what is appropriate for their kids in school libraries. We're not talking about public libraries. Go ahead.
Just as an example, so this is the book that I was just referring to, Court of Silver Flames, adult erotic fiction. I mean, it even says it straight on here. It says it's an erotic book. And this book is in Las Cruces. It's also in Cibola High School in Albuquerque. It's in Rio Grande High School in Albuquerque, West Mesa High School. It's in Roosevelt Middle School in Albuquerque and Van Buren Middle School. So, as well as Chaparral, Santa Teresa, Gadsden. So this is not a Las Cruces problem. This is a statewide systemic issue. And one of the things that Juan and I have found out is that the librarians don't actually even know what's in these books. They're just picking books off of a list from the American Library Association and the School Library Journal, and then they're just rubber stamping them and putting them in the schools without knowing what's in them. So when we have actually filed challenges against books, it's the first time they've actually even looked at them. Go ahead, Juan.
So one of the pushback that we get sometimes from citizens on Facebook, social media, and so forth, is that why are we meddling? Well, we're not meddling. You know, we have to draw a line and we have to start somewhere, because if you don't, then nothing's going to change. It'll progressively get worse. We've had incidents, and we've talked about this before, in one of the school buses here in Las Cruces, a school bus driver who was telling us about young girls practicing oral sex in the back of the bus at the age of 10, 11 years old. Now, you know, some parents may not think that that is an issue. Well, I think that that's an issue for young girls, or for young boys for that matter. It doesn't really matter what the gender is. I attended an equity council meeting recently, as a matter of fact, Wednesday, and they're talking about, you know, the behavior of some of our kids in schools, where they're not only just picking on fellow kids, they're even picking on teachers because of their race and because of their religion. So somewhere there has to be a reset point. And I think from our perspective, CCA's perspective, this is going to be a point that we picked, and we're going to push for a reset.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other things that I'm working on the statewide level is a teachers group. And I've got a group of over 200 teachers statewide that have been collaborating together for a few years, ever since the school closures and the mask mandates and whatnot. And they're reporting the same thing that Juan is just talking about here, where there are so many behavior problems going on in the schools. Teachers don't feel safe, students aren't safe, and there's really no consequences being imposed on children who are acting out and doing violent things and ripping bathroom sinks off and, you know, attacking teachers. One of the teachers in Albuquerque told me she's been threatened with assault by a student who has already done this sort of stuff, and she basically gets no backup. They just tell her, well, that kid's going to have to finish out the year. And so the teachers don't have the tools that they need to be able to deal with these issues. And then everything just spins from there. If you think about all the other problems we're seeing in New Mexico with crime and drugs and a lot of juvenile crime going on, a lot of that is going to stem back to the parents and the schools not actually teaching kids how to control themselves.
And quite frankly, I think this is an effort to normalize a lot of questionable or bad behavior, not only sexual behavior, but also, I mean, it's okay to, I guess, beat up on your teacher. It's okay to throw chairs around or what have you. And you see that, not just in schools, that's just the beginning. But I'm beginning to really connect some of the dots here in Las Cruces. And I'm not big into conspiracies, but it's pretty evident that you listen to our city council, you listen to our, in particular, city council, where they normalize a lot of the activity, a lot of the criminal acts that are happening in that community as well. You know, they have mental problems. It's because of poverty. There's always an excuse. There's no accountability. There's no responsibility. There's no consequences. Well, we'll give you a pass because whatever reason, in an effort to normalize.
Exactly. Well, Ben, I think that's our 10 minutes if you want to jump over.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for that. So we have Casey and Mike. They're going to give also an update, things they've found in schools in New Mexico, because we want people to see that this is, present day New Mexico. It's not like off in some other state or some other city that doesn't affect your child. Yeah. So go ahead, Casey.
All right. Yeah, I appreciate it. Mike's not going to be able to make it, but I cover down for her. And a lot of this work is thanks to her working by my side. Mikkel is my wife. And we got started back in 2020, August 2020. We blew the whistle on our national nuclear laboratories with what we saw going on in there. We didn't have the name for it at the time, but critical race theory is what it ended up being called eventually. And so I blew the whistle on our national nuclear laboratories with the help of my wife. And after we did that, one thing led to another, and we found out, had a bunch of people reporting to us that this was happening inside of our children's schools. And this was right as COVID was starting after the death of George Floyd. So all of this kicked off, and we attached this name critical race theory to all of these very racist, sexist, belittling ideologies that were being pushed down at the national nuclear labs. And so obviously that's not something that can continue to happen, because that's our national security. So we stood up and felt that moral draw to stand up there. And when it was pointed out that it was happening inside of our schools, we decided to go ahead and audit that and find out if that was indeed the case. And well, we started an organization eventually called Freedom Families United, just kind of a place for us to work from, and also start a website for us to be able to post videos and materials that we had found. But my wife and I started investigating inside of the schools, and the first thing we went to was a Building an Equity Bridge training. That's what it was called, Building an Equity Bridge. It was put on by the New Mexico Public Education Department, and they were working in conjunction with the Black Education Act and the Identity, Equity, and Transformation Departments of New Mexico. So this was coming from the top down, and we wanted to see, okay, we hear the word equity. Obviously, we know equity is the antithesis of equality. It is the equal outcomes rather than equal opportunities. So that's, of course, where we would see something like critical race theory rearing its head. And we went to that training, and of course, it was exactly what we had feared. And this was being taught to our teachers and administrators. We spoke to one of the superintendents that was in attendance there. He was one of their main superintendents, and you might be able to see on my screen here. This is on our website, freedomfamiliesunited.com, and we have all our videos posted up there. But the superintendent we spoke to, he talked about the guerrilla warfare tactics that they were using to sneak this into schools in Alamogordo, New Mexico, which is a strongly traditional values town inside of New Mexico. So that was very concerning to us, and they were exchanging this information as if it was guerrilla warfare. He used that term multiple times, that you had to sneak it in without them knowing, and how you would do that. We kept digging, and that led us to other investigations, digging around in schools in the East Mountains of here outside of Albuquerque, which aren't known for being particularly progressive or radical. And we found that they were indeed pushing not only critical race theory, but also radical gender ideology, allowing children to hide their gender identities from their parents, helping them to change their names and change even when they go to school. And then if the kids came and talked to these counselors, the counselors didn't have to tell the parents a lot of things. Even if the child was committing a little bit of self-harm or deeply depressed, they didn't have to report that to the parent. And they could get parents get children, kind of groom them down this road, this very dark road. And as we know, if you have gender dysphoria, you have a suicide rate that is 600% or 6 times that of your peers. It's a very dark road, and every other metric you could measure mental health by, whether it's substance abuse at young ages or mental disorders, it's a very dark road for these children. And to just take parents out of the equation, it is directly in opposition to parental rights. So through these investigations, undercover hidden camera investigations, and attending the trainings and hearing the words from their mouths, we realized that no, this isn't just a small thing. This is from the top down. This is coming from the New Mexico Public Education Department. And when it comes to critical race theory, we are likely one of the top 3 in the nation for pushing this. It was certainly in the top 5. Radical gender ideology might be a little further back, but we are certainly somewhere near the tip of the spear in pushing these very radical progressive ideologies in K through 12 education, particularly. And the last legislative session showed you where they want to go with all of this. Not the most recent, but the one before that, they had pushed a bunch of bills that are very damaging, directly targeting children and targeting parental rights. And leading up to that, we've uncovered this video here that is highlighted. This is a trainer that is speaking to the New Mexico School Board Association. So he's training the school boards of New Mexico. Any school board in the state can come take this training. And he's discussing with them that parents don't have a fundamental right to tell you what your child is taught in schools. Your parental rights end when you send your kid to public school. You don't like it? Too bad. Send your kid to a charter school, a private school, or homeschool them. But you, the taxpayer, do not have a fundamental right to dictate or have any say in what's being taught in public education. And he's essentially teaching these school board members how to ignore parents and how to work around them and how to scare parents off and continue pushing whatever ideologies they want. And they went and talked about specifically the Black Lives Matter organization, saying you have to teach about that. It would be wrong not to teach about it. You'd have to teach about these radical issues inside of school. So it's very much systemic, built into all of New Mexico schools from the top down. That's where it's coming. New Mexico Public Education Department, over the past 2 decades, really, has been working to consolidate power. The amount of power that you used to have in the Public Education Commission, the PEC, it's been gutted. That is our only elected body that represents what New Mexico parents want. That's our only elected body. I mean, you have school boards as well, but as far as from the top down, and they have no power. They strip their power, move that power into the PED, which is your appointed officials. Your governor just appoints those individuals, those radicals, and they've been ideologically captured at that level. And school boards themselves have also had a lot of their power removed and pulled up to the public education department level. And anywhere where we see that centralization of power, even throughout history, not even just talking about this issue, but anywhere you see power decentralized away from the family unit, away from the individual, you are going to see more totalitarian rule. You're going to see more damaging policies being thrust down upon citizens. And that even goes to corporations. Anytime you centralize that power into corporations and one corporation holds all that power, who suffers? It's the family, it's the individual, it's the little people that suffer. And that's happening here in New Mexico. So I guess if I have to summarize my message here, it's just that it is throughout the entire system and it's coming from the top down. And we don't even have to stop in New Mexico, because certainly this is happening through multiple states. This is an ideological movement that's being pushed nationwide.
Right on. Is that all you have, Casey?
That's it. And I'll leave more time if there's any questions or anything that I didn't clarify there. I just wanted to be short, sweet, and to the point with my
good
portion there.
So as far as the leaders, Blexit leaders, how does that make you feel as a parent?
As a parent, my first thought is Mama Bear kicks in 100%. And kind of like, where are all these Mama Bears? And to me, it's time to really make our voices heard and stand, because it's our children that they're coming against. And that's where the Mama Bear, for me, kicks in, definitely.
Yeah, I think it's just, when you said that they're taking more and more rights away and actually training, their leaders to how to sneak this in and kind of overstep, the parental rights. That was kind of like really shocking to me. And I guess it just makes me want to make, my friends and family just more aware of what's going on, since, my kids are in private school. I know a lot of people don't have that opportunity, or the privilege to be able to send their kids to private school or homeschool. And so it just makes me want to just reach out, for friends and family that do have their kids in public school and just make them more aware of what's going on. Because like I said, I'm just kind of feel like it's, my obligation to them to let them know, even though my kids are not in the public school system, just make them aware of, what's really going on from the top down.
Right on, yeah. So what I wanted to pretty much show everybody is that normal parents are getting involved. Sarah Smith was once that. Casey and Mike were once that parent that was not involved in politics, and so was I. And so I just wanted to show that pattern is happening in New Mexico. A lot of people are coming out of, their comfortable zone, and we're making a change, and it just starts with, standing for what's right and speaking what's right. And so we are. Yes, sir.
I just want to say one more thing, Ben. When it comes to Blexit, the ironic thing is that the pain that's being felt is being felt very disproportionately in the minority communities of New Mexico, because these are the parents that don't have the means to just take out their children and spend thousands of dollars to send their child to a private school or drive them 45 minutes every day one way to a different school. And so it's the very communities that they claim to uphold and champion that are being harmed the most.
Right. No, definitely. And I think that is their strategy as well. is pretty much plugging in, go into the worst part of a city and be that change. We do have James Lindsay here, waiting on standby. I did listen to the rest of his Joe Rogan interview. That's probably the most descriptive interview that I've heard as far as him kind of diving deep. And then plus Joe Rogan asked the questions that makes it make sense to like the common citizen. So James, glad to have you. I know you hate Zooms, but I appreciate you jumping on Zoom.
I do hate Zoom. That's a true statement. In fact, Zoom is my least favorite technology of the current age. But it's easier than a flight, that's for sure. So yeah, thanks for having me. I know you want me to talk about CRT, but having listened in, I want to make a couple of connections before I talk about critical race theory specifically. And Casey's right. We have been using, that was largely a charge led by our mutual friend, Chris Rufo, to kind of make critical race theory be a catch-all term for kind of all of these different domains, even though like obviously the weird gender and sex books aren't race. That was a kind of a deliberate strategy to brand it and toxify it. But critical race theory is one dimension of a much broader program, and these programs all work the exact same way. So whether it's the sex stuff, whether it's the sexuality stuff, whether it's the feminist side of it, whether it's the environmental side, whether it's the stuff we faced with COVID, with the pandemic, what you start to find, or what you find with politics, where they started to call all of the MAGA people deplorables, for example. This is all exactly the same playbook that's playing out again and again and again in different domains. And so if we talk about one, we talk about all. Because they're all the same thing. So almost everything I say outside of the minute details of critical race theory applies to all of the rest of these domains identically, because it's the exact same program. They just have slightly different pictures. And so Ben gave me a short list. Let me make sure I don't miss anything. One of the things he wants me to actually mention is to talk about how CRT has been rebranded, because again, following Chris Rufo and Casey's and my work a couple of years ago, we did toxicify that brand. In fact, what we did was exposed critical race theory. I've been told by people who are in standing to know that the regime, or whatever we want to call the powers that be, this top-down power, that they did not expect that we would identify and explain critical race theory to the average person nearly as quickly as we did. And so we were able to poison that brand, and they've had to move away from it. It mostly has hidden itself in two ways. One of those two ways is by putting out other dimensions of the attack, which primarily has been the sexuality dimension, almost overwhelmingly. I think we're going to see that's kind of, I mean, they're still pushing it very hard. They're not going to stop pushing it in the schools in particular, but it's not going to be as in our face as it has been the last 2 years. I think we're going to move to an immigration theory now, based off of this idea that criminal aliens are equivalent to legal immigrants, and they're all humans, and so they have equal rights. And what are they calling them now? Undocumented Americans and migrants, and all of these absolutely bogus terms. And they're going to demand that we treat them as though they are just another American citizen, and in fact one who's oppressed and therefore has to be lifted up. So I think we're going to see another shape shift this year. But the main brand it's been hiding under hasn't just been to switch which face of the monster is showing, from race to sexuality to, I think the next one will be this national origin question, or citizenship status question, with the goal of moving toward what they call a global citizenship. But the other way that they've hidden it is that it largely just kind of went into this kind of melting pot of bad ideology called diversity, equity, and inclusion. It mostly just got called DEI. And I'm very excited. I'm seeing just in the last couple of weeks, I think we have now made diversity a toxic word. And I can tell that because they've now accused Chris Rufo, along with Donald Trump, along with a number of other people, of being something like white diversity hires, which means they now know that diversity hire means bad. And they are now kind of confessing that it's an embarrassing state to be in. And so we have made a lot of progress, but it will continue to shift names. The kind of words they almost can't get away from are equity and inclusion. I think they're going to lose diversity, honestly, but equity and inclusion are so core to what they're doing, they can't really get away from those. I'll talk a bit about CRT specifically. and then I'll come back to diversity and equity and inclusion, because I think there's such important concepts to how all of this works. But one more point I want to add to everything I heard so far is that we're talking about this top down, and this is top down. I mean, I know we don't want to be conspiracy theorists or whatever, but I will put my tinfoil hat on. I did it, Rogan. I'm not afraid to do it in front of 10 million people. I'm not afraid to do it here. This is a very deliberate top-down agenda. The Biden administration and most of the state's governors are on board with it. I think Ron DeSantis in Florida is an example of somebody who's maybe not as on board with it. But the majority, even of the so-called conservative states, your neighbor to the north, if my geography is right, no, wait, maybe we have to go further west. Utah, at any rate, is definitely fully on board with this, pretending to be conservative. This is a top-down effort through the biggest players on the planet, including the World Economic Forum, of course, the United Nations, and the WHO. Just to highlight, the WHO, the World Health Organization, is having a pandemic treaty. It's called the Pandemic Accords and an associated treaty coming at the end of May. And it gives them the power to handle all public health crises in the world, to remove sovereignty. So there'll be no Florida, that's the so-called free state of Florida, doing something different than Michigan or California or New Mexico or whatever other state and deciding we're going to end the lockdowns and we're going to get back to business. That won't be allowed. The WHO will have total pandemic control power for any public health emergency whatsoever. But that's going to include, on their list of potential public health emergencies, aren't just pandemics, but they're also that racial injustice or racial inequity, systemic racism, is a public health emergency. The unwillingness to support and affirm transgender is a public health emergency. The inadequacy of food inequity in food systems is a public health emergency. Gun ownership and gun violence is a public health emergency. Pollution and other environmental issues are a public health emergency. Even the misinformation and disinformation, in other words, things they don't want you to hear, are a public health emergency. And the accords require explicitly censorship from every participating government. So that's very, very top down. But in addition to this being top down, it's also bottom up. The goal is actually, why this is in the schools, is to indoctrinate your children. And there's a book that was published by Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum 2 years ago in 2022. It's called The Great Narrative for a Better Future. And he says explicitly that we're going to use these tools at the top down level to force corporations and governments to do what we want. He's particularly talking about ESG and the associated values, the environmental, social, governance scoring, which, by the way, we've also put on its back foot, and they're trying to rebrand that, just like they are DEI, just like they are CRT. So in addition, though, what Klaus says is if we can't force the corporations and the people to go along with it from a top-down pressure using banks and capital and governments, what we're going to do is there's going to also be a bottom-up pressure by molding the youth to demand these values. And that's what's happening in the schools. So your kids are being taught well, first of all, to protest everything that goes against the agenda. Instead of learning how to do math, learning how to read, they're learning how to show up and protest for left-wing causes. That's more or less all they're actually learning. They're learning to hate their country because they need counter-hegemonic values. They're learning, in addition, though, don't work for a company, don't buy from a company, don't supply to a company that isn't in line with these values. Don't serve customers who aren't in line with these values, and tell on your neighbors. I don't know if you know, I mean, New Mexico has its share of problems, and I know this is about New Mexico, but the state of Washington right now isn't just flirting with, they've put forth a bill, and I think it's made it through one of the chambers, where they're offering citizens up to $2,000 to snitch on their neighbors for bias incidents. And so if it's neighbors snitching on neighbors, that's bottom up as well as top down. So this is a bottom up and top down squeeze on our society. So I'm going to cut all the baloney. I wrote a book a couple of years ago explaining critical race theory in tremendous depth and detail, and it's a history. And then the title of the book tells you what critical race theory really is, which tells us that exactly what we're dealing with. And like I said, all of these pieces, it doesn't matter if it's the pandemic, it doesn't matter if it's sexuality, it doesn't matter if it's critical race theory and the racial justice question, it doesn't matter if it's even the politics like MAGA stuff. It's all the same formula, and that formula is told in the title. Critical Race Theory, the book that I wrote exposing it, is titled Race Marxism. What's happening is that a Marxist ideology in multiple dimensions has been unleashed on our society. Critical race theory reproduces the Marxist ideology to a T. There's even a book that really gave me the idea in the first place. It's written by a critical race theorist who recently died. His name's Charles Mills. And he wrote a book called From Class to Race. 2000-ish. I forget what year exactly that book was published. And what he's doing is explaining why he stopped being a classical Marxist and started being a critical race theorist. And what he did was that he took the same architecture and he substituted out economic class as the relevant variable of oppression and substituted in race as the relevant variable of oppression that's most consequential in American society. So it's very simple to actually trace their lineage. Critical race theory grew out of a combination of the Black liberationism movement, along with the critical legal theory movement, along with what's called Black feminism, which was a feminist offshoot of the Black liberation movement. And the people that were involved explicitly said that they derived their tactics from the tactics of Mao Zedong. I mean, in black and white in print, they put this out. This is what we're actually dealing with, is a Maoist cultural revolution using things like race, sex, gender, sexuality, and a little bit of class, but also, national origin status, immigration status, public health issues, and sustainable behavior, sustainability, environmental behavior as different dimensions, so that when they attack you with one and we put up a fight and we figure it out, they can attack you with another. And meanwhile, they just keep feeding all of it to our kids. So here's how that actually works. This is really simple. Marxism believes, if you read the first page of the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx said on the first page that, in a word, what communism boils down to is oppressor versus oppressed. He says the entire movement of history is conflict, and it is conflict, in a word, between oppressor versus oppressed. And the way that the conflict works is that you have an oppressor class that has assigned itself access to a special form of property. For him, it was private property and capital, which you can exclude other people from. And there's an oppressed class who basically has to do their bidding because they don't have access to the special capital. So the super wealthy continue to get wealthy because they have access to capital, which is basically property or wealth that can multiply itself. And other people have to be their employees and get paid wages that are barely enough to live, so they can never actually accrue any capital. So they're locked out of the capital game. And this sets up an oppressive situation where there's a form of private property some people have access to, and they are the oppressors, and they exploit everybody else and alienate them from their true selves by forcing them to be wage slaves, so to speak, and excluding them from access into the capital club. As it turns out, that doesn't work in the United States. We've always had an American dream here from the very beginning. We've always had this attitude up until the last 10, 15 years, that if you work hard, you get an education, you put your head down and do your job, and you get a little bit lucky here and there, but you take advantage when your luck shows up. Because sometimes luck shows up and people don't do anything. Chance favors the prepared mind is the old saying. If you do that, you can make it. And I personally know guys that grew up blue collar, lower class, working concrete, who ended up, parents die, tragic story, ends up taking his concrete business over at 17 years old, building it up. He's in his 70s now, and he's worth $2.5 billion. So the rags to riches story is real in the United States, and people know it. So none of that worked. So over the course of the 20th century, the Marxists tried to figure out what were the soft spots of American politics. What Mao did to soften up China was he used identity politics, but he defined all the identities in terms of the revolution and in terms of communist things. They copied this mentality, and they created theories like critical race theory and queer theory and radical Marxist feminism and all the rest of them, ability studies and everything else, in order to be able to take advantage of the fact that we are a very, surprisingly, given that we're supposed to be hardcore capitalists, we're a very compassionate society, and we actually do care about the underdog, and we have a lot of backbone and Christian values that do care about elevating the poor. So anyway, the long and short is that Marxism boils down to Some people assign themselves a special form of property and lock other people out. Economic Marxism didn't work in the United States. And so they figured out through mostly the 1960s that we had softer spots in identity politics following the ideas of Mao Zedong. And so they formulated a Marxism that attacks race. They formulated a Marxism that attacks sex, like male female. That's in the feminist vein. They formulated a Marxism that attacks the idea of normalcy as a form of private property. So what they did in CRT was they erected this system where the point is that whiteness is treated explicitly as a form of private property. There's a paper from Cheryl Harris from 1993 that's considered foundational to the entire field of study, if we can even call it a field of study, called Whiteness as Property. And she explains that whiteness forms a type of bourgeois private property. Well, what did Karl Marx say in the Communist Manifesto about bourgeois private property? He said communism can be summarized in a single sentence, which is abolish private property. Well, what does critical race theory exist to do? Abolish whiteness. So what's whiteness? Whiteness is an extension of the concept of private property. It includes private property and private property ownership and private property rights, but it also includes cultural capital, social capital. It includes these kind of not even American values. I want it to really be focused on American values, but it's not just American values. They're actually just good values like punctuality, work ethic, showing up to your job, like wanting to get ahead, like basic stuff, right? Being well behaved. When you guys talk about the consequences of restorative justice and the violence and the bad behavior in schools. And what this does is it frames it all out as a form of whiteness that has excluded certain people from full participation in society. And it sets up the exact same conflict that Marx outlines in the first page of the Communist Manifesto, oppressor versus oppressed. So then they start telling people, for example, they tell black people, you can't get ahead because white people expect you to behave in a particular way, which is to say to act white. So you can't get ahead unless you throw away your cultural heritage. You can't get ahead unless you throw away who you really are and operate on other people's terms. This is, of course, very insidious. Queer theory does the exact same thing by saying, well, certain people said this is what it means to be normal, and I'm normal, and those weirdos and perverts and kinksters and degenerates and groomers and pedophiles are not normal, and they went to bat for all of the not normal people, including everything I just listed, plus the mentally ill, and said, basically, it's an illegitimate construct that certain people say we're normal and other people are not, so now we have to let the floodgates open and let everybody be considered normal on equal terms. That's the equity there. But as you see, unleashing these things on society not only is dangerous in and of itself, but it also creates these lines of grievance that are being stoked. What Thomas Sowell said, keeping racism and so on life support in order that they are able to manipulate it. And the reason that they do this is because they're Marxists. The reason that it primarily hurts the communities they claim to champion is because they're Marxists. Marxists they believe consciousness is a consequence of pain. So when you suffer, you come to what they believe is the true consciousness of reality, which for them is that we're a social species, which means everybody helps each other, which means the people who are oppressing you are supposed to give you their money. And literally, this is the basis of their entire program. So CRT, down to its fundamental roots, is just a reconfiguration of Marxist ideology into the racial domain, where race is considered the primary line of division in society instead of economic class. Queer theory is the same thing, where normalcy is considered to be, actually not just normalcy, but in their own definition, normalcy and legitimacy are considered to be the dividing line of society, of oppressor versus oppressed. And of course, we could do it with male and female, with sexism and feminism, but that got all weird because now we have to let men be women and the men have to be better women. They're like women plus or something. So it's a little more complicated and kind of falling apart on them. There's a whole explanation for why the revolution does that, but that's beside the point. So what CRT is a reconfiguration of Marxism using race and agitating racially. And I just want to tell you real quick to summarize that in fact, critical race theory was invented in China. Critical race theory is invented in collaboration with the Soviet Union, and it was put together by Mao Zedong, and it was utilized to destroy the Nationalist Party of China, which was called the Kuomintang, in the 1930s. So that the revolution that Mao launched in 1946 through 1949 was more likely and eventually did succeed. And what do I mean by that? Well, China, I don't know how much you know about China in terms of its ethnicities, but there are 56 ethnicities in China. One of them is Han. The Han Chinese outnumber all the other Chinese by a factor of like 10 to 1 of all of the other 55 combined. So it is an overwhelmingly Han population. And so the Nationalist Party put together this campaign like, no more of this. We're going to unify as one nation. We're Chinese people. They called them Huarun in Chinese and Mandarin. We're gonna be one people, the Chinese people. And the CCP came along and started saying, yeah, they're saying you're Chinese people, but what they're really saying is you have to act Han. If you want to fit into society, you have to be a Han person. You have to give up your Hmong or your Cantonese identities, and you need to act like a Han. And so it's really, they say it's Chinese people, but it's really Han people. So you've got to, as CRT would say, you have to act white in order to succeed, and they use it to stoke racial division. The CCP, literally Mao Zedong himself, before he became chairman of the CCP, was going around and sowing division within the Nationalist Party and within the communities of China on exactly the same lines. This critical race theory is actually an import from the Chinese communist model, and it is used to break apart national unity. And it was extraordinarily successful there, and it's extraordinarily successful here, and it's extraordinarily successful in Canada and in Australia and in the United Kingdom and across Europe, using slightly different, formulations of their racial histories to get the ball across the goal line. And so what we're dealing with is a communist infiltration and attack on our society, trying to tear us apart. And who ends up benefiting? Well, it's not the communities they champion. It's the grifters who go in and say they're going to benefit the communities. They elevate themselves. The party elevates itself. Everybody else loses. Their systems don't work. And when we heard, earlier, I think Juan is who said it, is that there's always excuses. There's always some excuse for why they can't do things right. Yeah, well, that's what they do. They break things and then they say somebody else is the reason it broke. We would have a system that worked, but some people are just so entrenched in their racism, they won't let it go. That would be the CRT line. We could have a system, but some people just can't let go of their transphobia. That would be the line in the trans stuff and in queer theory. We could have a system, but some people are selfish and they're anti-vaxxers and they won't get their shot, so we have to keep society locked down and keep your kids out of school. It's the same formula again and again and again and again, and the formula boils down to Maoism. And Mao got it from the Soviets, and the Soviets were putting into practice communist theory that they got straight out of the Communist Manifesto. And so this is ultimately what we're dealing with. We're trying right now. What in the world do you do about communism? Well, first of all, I heard it earlier. I want to tell my friends and neighbors about this now. This is what you have to do. We have to actually awaken people that there is a wholesale attempt to steal our liberty and to steal our children as functionaries of taking away our liberty. The Chinese did that too. Mao mobilized. Everybody's seen the opening scene now to the three body problem because that went super viral, what the Chinese Cultural Revolution really looked like. But if you look at the people that are doing, so you got to, if you haven't seen it, you should go watch it. It's 3 minutes long, but you have this physics professor who ends up getting, no spoiler alert or whatever, but he gets beat to death on stage and he's being humiliated and whatever else in front of this huge crowd that's chanting for revolution and holding up their little red books. And if you actually look at who's doing it, who's bullying the physics professor, who's attacking him, it's one of his own students. They're children. It is the children that they want to radicalize, to turn on society, to turn on their parents, to turn on their teachers, to turn on their grandparents, up to the point as shown there, which, by the way, is a very tame description, is what almost all the Chinese people that I've seen are talking about that scene. They're like, that's tame compared to what really happened. Thank God somebody's finally showing it. They want the children to erupt against their society, and that's why this is happening in our schools. The only way to get this to stop is to get a lot of people to wake up, start protecting their kids from what's happening to them in the schools, to realize this is real, that this is happening, and that their liberty and their children and their futures and their children's futures and lives are literally at stake. None of this ever goes well for the people involved. And so even the kids that get hopped up in this and they think they're going to be big party functionaries, they're not. Most of them end up getting killed after the revolution, or they get sent off to prison or whatever else. I don't know what the form of it will be in our society. I don't think it's going to be the brutal 20th century forms. I think they have more sophisticated ways to ruin people's lives. Social credit lockdowns, more or less. You probably won't be allowed to leave your house. Or buy anything, but something like this to try to contour the radicalism back out of people. And it's not going to go well. So that's what CRT is. That's why it's being implemented. That's how it works in tandem. The idea with CRT working in tandem with queer theory is if you bully people about their race and then tell them they get they have a get out of jail free card if they adopt a sexual minority or a gender minority identity, they're going to do that. So you tell these kids like you're worthless because you're, a white girl, or you aren't an activist enough, or you're not doing whatever. But by the way, if you're trans, or if you're, some weird made up sexuality like demisexual or whatever, and you go be a radical in the name of those things, well, then we're going to celebrate you and affirm you and carry you on. You make people feel bad about who they are, that they can't change, and then tell them they can change something that through subjective determination, and they go off and become more and more radicalized. And the goal is to produce that radical youth contingent that builds the bottom up pressure that coordinates with the top down pressure. And this is, I hate to say it, this is what's really happening in this country. A lot of money is going into it. There are some very easy and also more sophisticated guesses as to why. I don't think that the people pushing this from, say, the United Nations are necessarily specifically communist. I think that they are oligarchs, and they know that communism breaks a society. How do you break a society as strong as the United States? You have to do something very radical, and communism ruins every society. So if you can bring communism in and get people to hate the United States from the inside, then you can change it. So the last thing I'll say actually is not about CRT, and I'll tell you about a couple of things Ben wanted me to tell you that I've been doing to bring light to this that you can share with people. But I, unfortunately, I just spent a lot of time studying George Soros, and George Soros's theory of change was what I was trying to figure out. How does George Soros, why does he fund these DAs? Why does he fund all this stuff at the border? Why does he fund so much chaos? And we had what Elon Musk said, George Soros hates the United States. It turns out he doesn't hate the United States at all. It turns out what George Soros doesn't like is that we don't have a wide open society, one giant global community. But what he actually thinks is that the United States is overvalued. He thinks that the United States is not as good as it pretends to be. The American exceptionalism says that it's actually in a sense, like a financial bubble that needs to be popped, that you can profit off of if you short sell against it. So how do you short sell against an institutional favorite like the United States? You make the people inside the United States hate the United States, especially the young people, so that it collapses. Meanwhile, you place bets that it's going to collapse, and you win off of those bets. Those bets might be financial, but the bets might also be socio-political, to install a new kind of political system that's not the Constitution protecting the individual rights of United States citizens, but not any other citizens. The U.S. Constitution gives us an open society, as he calls it, but it only gives the Americans an open society. It does not give Mexicans. It does not give Guatemalans. It does not give Chinese. It does not give Africans. It does not give anybody else an open society. So that's not fair. And so what you do is you wither away and create chaos on the inside of the United States so that you can short sell against the United States and get a system change out of it by directing through propaganda where it goes once the chaos starts. That's George Soros's MO. That's why George Soros funds the African American Policy Institute, which is the primary nonprofit that pushes policy level critical race theory and school level critical race theory in the world. And that's part of why this is happening. And it's so hard to get rid of, is because there are insane amounts of money, insane amounts of political corruption. Like you said, you have people trying to figure out ways through guerrilla warfare to install this into schools, even when people know they don't want it, even when states where, it's not in New Mexico, or maybe it is. I don't think it is, though. But in some states, it's actually illegal to put this in the schools. And they're still finding ways, they call them finding co-conspirators, to install it in the schools against the law, risking their own lives in terms of going to jail or being heavily fined or losing their jobs. They're still doing this in states like South Carolina, and there are people caught on tape. They're utterly devoted to doing this. And it's a very serious fight. The way we win the fight is the same way we won the fight. Do you have a vaccine passport? No, you don't. Why don't you have a vaccine passport? Too many people said, I'm not doing that. It would have been way too complicated to figure out how to do it, and they would have had to use way too much tyranny and force to make everybody participate when they refused. The way that you get people, the way that we stop this is actually get people awake to it, speaking out about it, running for office against it, but in particular, refusing to participate in the pieces of it so that they can't actually implement it. And that requires them to know what's going on and understand what's happening and why it's happening.
Well, cool, James. I appreciate that. Talk about your book real quick. Did you
Oh
talk
yeah,
about that?
Ben wanted me to talk about my own stuff, and I'm a terrible promoter of my own stuff. If you want a really detailed deep dive, I'm going to talk about 2 books and 2 movies. So if you want a really deep dive, really good deep dive into critical race theory, the book that I wrote a couple of years ago is called Race Marxism. The title tells you the punchline. What is critical race theory? It's race Marxism, and it's fairly long. I'm not going to lie. I wish I could tell you, oh, it's an easy read. Pick it up. You'll love it. It's a great weekend read. It's fairly challenging. It's fairly academic, but it really pulls back the curtain all the way back to some really deep philosophical roots. And it turns out if you don't want the really hard parts, chapters 3 and 4, you could skip those. Those are the really hard parts. The rest of it's actually pretty readable. Chapters 1, 2, 5, and 6 are actually a lot easier. So Race Marxism is my book about CRT. I've got a new book. I'll hold it up about queer theory in the schools. It is called I guess it's backwards, The Queering of the American Child, and it has this cool apple with a bite taken out of it with a rainbow flag inside, the fruit of the tree of evil or something like that on the cover. So it's called The Queering of the American Child. It's about what queer theory is, why it's basically a cult, why they're using schools and how it got into schools to indoctrinate our kids into a sex-based cult that's meant intentionally to destabilize them. And it's much easier to read. The main author, Logan Lansing, is very good at writing for normal people, whereas I'm not that good at that. And he did a very good job making it accessible, easy to read. Most people have written back to me and said that they started to read it, they couldn't put it down, and they finished it in the same day they started it, and that it's extremely clarifying and extremely scary. But the goal for us is to get people to understand that it operates according to cult logic. The stuff that's happening with the trans, with the sexuality, it's all a cult. The reason the books, like you showed Sarah at the beginning, the reason these books are being held up and so on in the schools and why they're being defended is because they want to introduce the ideas to the kids and get them talking about it and thinking about it so that they can then take them into an after school club or whatever, or a counseling session, and start taking them down the road into the cult initiation, basically. As that's how we frame it. So those 2 books, Queering of the American Child and Race Marxism, kind of pull back the curtain on the 2 biggest pieces of the identity politics movement. I'm working on a new one about the Mao stuff, about how Maoism works, that I hope we'll have by the end of the year. I'm going to call it Maoism with American characteristics. So keep your eyes open for it, but it doesn't exist yet, so don't get too excited. 2 movies. One I am involved in that's very pertinent for religious people. I've seen it, believe it or not. I haven't seen half the documentaries I'm in, but there's one called Letter to the American Church that is produced by Turning Point USA and Eric Metaxas, and it is unbelievable. It's very good. It's a tight, action-packed, and I mean it, hour of explaining the big picture of what's happening and what's at stake, and particularly what's at stake for the church and what churches can do to fight back. It's very good. Actually, I see Alex put a note, Fault Lines by Vodi Bakum is also very good. Vodi and I, for what it's worth, I only mentioned that since it was on the screen, but I mentioned it because when Vodi was writing that, Vodi was calling me on WhatsApp from Africa virtually every day, and we were talking through some of the issues to help him get it. So I contributed behind the scenes to Fault Lines quite a lot, and I've read it, I have it, it's very good. Vodi was very kind to give me a nice signed copy, and he's a great guy. But the other movie is one that I have coming out at the end of May, so in about 2 months from now, and it's called Beneath Sheep's Clothing, and it's actually based on a book by the same name by a woman named Julie Beeling, who's in Utah, southern Utah, who studied Soviet history and literature, but since she was Mormon, she also did her mission in Russia like 2 years after the Soviet Union ended. So she actually went to Russia and learned what was going on with religion, in particular dissident Christianity, but also mainline Christianity through the history of Soviet Union, came back and did a double master's degree in Russian history and literature, and wrote this book to explain that what's happening in A, our churches, and B, our schools, parallels exactly what was going on in Soviet Union in order to indoctrinate kids and to take the whole culture's religion away from them. And so we put together a documentary. It's looking like it's quite the it's 2 hours long. It's a little bit more of a bite to watch it, but it's very exciting, very well put together. Of course, we're still tweaking it since it comes out in May, but I'm actually involved in the production of that one, unlike Letter to the American Church, and I really recommend it. You can find these things. I don't know where to find Letter to the American Church. You have to go search that for yourself because that's not my product. But Queering of the American Child is at queeringbook.com, and Race Marxism is at, get ready for it, racemarxism.com. And Beneath Sheep's Clothing is at beneathsheepsclothing.movie. And you can find those things there and kind of stay abreast of what's going on or pick them up.